Welcome to this CoastWA training session for community and stakeholder engagement in coastal hazard risk management adaptation planning. I'm Anna Kelderman and I will take you through the training session for today. Before I get started, just wanting to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land in the lands and the waters that we work on around the state and in different territories. In this particular module, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we have some long and enduring relationships with the coastal land and waters. That interface is really important for food, for gathering, for hunting, for celebrations, and we do quite regularly intersect with Indigenous values, and they might be tangible values and they might be intangible values, and it becomes really important to have the conversation with Indigenous people throughout the work that we do with CHAMAP planning. Let's just talk a little bit about what the training session is for. I will just do a little bit of framing. I'll talk about existing guidance. We're really fortunate we do have some really good state planning guidance for this, for engagement. The sorts of things that we might consider, why is this different to engagement in other fields? Sort of a typical approach, again, framed around some other policy guidance and some tools to use. All right, so engagement is required in the various policy documents of the CHAMAP process, and implicit and then sometimes explicit throughout that is the need to engage with communities and stakeholders. The difference, I think, with engaging for CHAMAP, there is both a very, very immediate thing to deal with, and then there is also things that are so far into the future that most of the people you're talking to won't be alive. So there is a complex layering of things that might seem a little urgent, but that perhaps aren't, and things that are perhaps very, very long term, but you do need to urgently start making decisions about it or thinking about how you're going to make decisions. It also treads some fine lines. In some cases, you need to be a little bit alarmist and then also reassuring. And you need to provide some truth about what might be lost, but also some potential wins, problems and solutions. It's really difficult. A lot of the time we are talking with people who have really closely held values in their immediate vicinity, and we're talking about the potential disruption of those values, and we're asking them to make decisions when their own values are at risk, but we're also asking them to make decisions for the best outcome for all people around them. So it can be quite difficult. Complex, extremely challenging. So this module starts to recognise that the recommendations that we put into CHAMAPs are becoming, I guess, more well understood, and the communities are reacting in lots of different ways. It can be difficult to achieve good planning. I think this is something I've read across the country, how hard it is to get people engaged in the CHAMAP process until they think that it might be impacting them directly, and then they get very engaged and not necessarily in positive ways. There's lots of external factors, obviously, that influence the engagement processes, and this, I guess, would be one of my key takeaways is that engagement for coastal hazard planning is part of a much longer journey to build coastal literacy. So to give our community knowledge and awareness and the support for their own coastal adaptation. I'll make the point a few times. Most of the people we deal with who are engaging on coastal hazard planning are going to be there much longer than we are. We might change jobs, or we might move to a different local government to do that consultancy work, but a lot of those people are the ones that are going to be sitting there living the adaptation dream. So we want to give them as much time and energy as we can so they can develop their own coastal literacy. So specifically, the module will provide information about some nuances of coastal hazard engagement and some case studies and some learnings. Who, what, why, when, how of engagement, guidance and examples for engagement, when to employ other methods, assets to support you. So in this module, one of the things that we will be doing is giving you quite a lot of tools. This module has been prepared assuming a fairly wide audience. Primarily, we're talking about local government authority and coastal managers who are responsible for delivering CHAMAPs. That could range from the Environment and Sustainability Officer to the engineering team, to the planning team,
to the engagement, the community development directorate. So this is really trying to open it wide for that whole range of disciplines within the coastal management group. But it's also a bit of a guide for some consultants who are developing char maps. That includes engagement practitioners. So there'll be a lot of engagement practitioners that are really well versed in doing engagement that might not have dipped their toe in the water of char map engagement. The other thing is it could be useful, the tools could be useful for natural resource management groups and community groups that are involved. The quick framing, coastal hazards, so what are they? Risk management, what are we responding to? Adaptation, what are the options to respond and plan, what do we do next? I'm sort of framing this as that community and stakeholders should be able to recognise what the risks are and the potential impacts in this part of it. They should be involved in determining responses and they should be partners in delivery. And they will become progressively more so as the decisions impact them directly. Where do we get it? The char map process head of power, it's sitting in the State Coastal Planning Policy 2.6, website link there, State Coastal Planning Policy Guidelines, and then of course we jump down into the Coastal Hazard Risk Management and Adaptation Planning Guidelines. So lots and lots of content there. You've also got a consultant scope of works, and there is also now a draft scope of works template available through the coastal team at DPLH to do a review of char maps, which is a slightly different kettle of fish than starting from scratch. And this is what it looks like. We're picking up some very clear engagement processes at stage 1 and stage 6, 7. So it's explicitly suggested that we do some engagement in stage 1 around values. And then when we get to stage 6, that's when it's explicitly sort of suggested in the guidelines. And of course, most local governments who do this work have their own processes for community engagement, particularly at that end part of the char map, whether it's a 4-week period or a 6-week period. What's less explicit is where else we might engage. We might do some more detailed community and stakeholder engagement in stage 5. And then obviously this is as you start to deliver and implement. What is your intentional plan to engage beyond the delivery of the char map? With this one here, I would sort of describe it as if you're really putting a lot of eggs in this basket, it's probably because the circumstances require it. And this training module will start to give you an indication of some of the reasons why the circumstances might in fact require it. The second one, which is beyond the conclusion of the char map delivery, I think it's really important, but if you've delivered a char map over several years and you've talked to people quite a bit and then you go into total stasis and you don't speak to them again, it can be quite difficult when you come back to review it to pick up that relationship again. So this is what the guidelines are saying specifically. Whilst characterising coastal hazards should be done by technical experts, assessing risk arising from coastal hazards, consequences, asset values and risk management measures is best done through an open process with input from an informed community and stakeholders. Stakeholders should be able to understand the adaptation measures, trade-offs and partner with coastal managers for implementation. The guidelines suggest, and they reference the International Association for Public Participation, which all the engagement practitioners will know all about, based on the belief that those who are affected by a decision, i.e. may be fundamentally impacted by coastal hazards, have a right to be involved in the decision-making process. This is the IEP2 public participation spectrum that's in the guidelines. I mean, fundamentally what it's trying to say is that as you run from the left to the right, you have increasing levels of public impact through your engagement process. We call it the spectrum from inform through consult, involve, collaborate and empower. This diagram here is starting to give you a sort of a quick illustration of the relationship. So at the inform end of the spectrum, typically you are speaking to, you're telling, informing. When we get to consult, we may be listening to. When you get to involve, it's more of a two-way conversation. Collaborate is a two-way conversation, then a conversation amongst the community. And then when we get to empower, there's a lot of conversations going every which way, and that's really at a point where you're saying the decision making is in the hands of the public. I've not yet seen a CHAR map that puts the decision making power in the hands of the public, but I think we're getting pretty close to the collaborate part of the spectrum, which is I think it's pretty exciting when it's necessary, I should say. I think one of the things I really want to stress is you don't need to go all in if it's not necessary, if there's not really much going on, if it's not too dramatic. There's plenty of time to get more serious about it later. But if there's urgent impacts, then you're really starting to think, okay, what do we need to do and how soon do we need to do it? The one other place that you'll find a little bit of information is the Coastal Planning and Management Manual, 2003 document, full of tips and tricks about the types of people you want to engage with. It talks about Indigenous participation. It highlights common coastal management problems, which quite often come up in coastal hazard planning. It highlights a number of stakeholders of interest. And it's just, I mean, it's genuinely a good piece of information. I'm going to change tact a little bit here because you'll be pleased to know that there is a whole bunch of other support work for doing engagement. Basically, the guidelines suggest developing a community and stakeholder engagement strategy or plan. It says that we should seek out a variety of external stakeholder groups. It says we should undertake internal engagement within our organisations, provide multiple opportunities, particularly identifying values. So the guidelines are really clear about the values component. But we're lucky in Western Australia to have a guide to best practice planning engagement in Western Australia. It's really set up very much for the planning system. So this module is going to refer back to it. So it has a 6-step process. The first is to define what is your proposal. The second is to identify who needs to be engaged and why. And the third is to design how you are going to engage. Those 3 steps get you to the point of an engagement strategy. And then implement is your 4th step. Put your engagement strategy into action. 5 is what did the community engagement tell you? So that's your sort of analytics phase of what you've heard. And then 6 is reflection and feedback, which is about then what does that mean for the proposal that we have engaged on. I guess the only thing that I would say about this is because it's built for the entire West Australian planning system, it's quite generic. It does provide a clear description of the benefits of good engagement. It has a specific discussion about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement, youth and older people, people from culturally and linguistically diverse groups, that's what we would call called groups. It has a template engagement strategy, so you don't even have to make up the framework for writing a strategy. It has a bit of information about stakeholder mapping and factors to consider and a reporting template. However, because it's so generic, it's probably not giving you enough direct information that would be useful for CHAR mapping. The material that we are preparing goes into a slightly more level of detail. So just for example, looking at the stakeholder mapping and factors to consider, it asks more specific questions that are much more relevant to CHAR map than to generic planning. So I think that will be quite helpful for anybody who's scoping a CHAR map or planning to do their own engagement internally. It also includes a plain language guide and common acronyms. The material that we are preparing, an additional sort of plain language and acronym guide for CHAR mapping. Just a few notes. Engagement, a 2-way discussion with the community involved in knowledge sharing, education and decision making. Consultation, typically minimum obligations, often later in the continuum, so often when you're advertising your final draft is what I would usually call consultation. And then communication is sharing content. So this is more that inform end of the spectrum. Now we're going to get into the where to start and the actual doing of engagement process. So the CHAR map process and engagement. Like I said before, task 1 to 3, if we just refer back to these guys, tasks 1 to 3 are largely undertaken at stage 1. And task 4, implement, also begins in stage 1. So you're really front-ending your engagement. It's written like that in the scope of works, but it does mean that you are writing an engagement strategy at a point in time where you have a lot less information than you have later on in the CHARMAP process. So I'll give you a few hints on that. So that first step, which is define, and this is, as I said, quite difficult because we don't have the mapping and the data in a detailed way that we can say this is what's going to happen. But we do start to ask ourselves the question when we're writing an engagement strategy, and these are some of them. In the materials that will be available to you, I've got sub-questions to each of these. But there's a couple of really basic ones, like what's the likely hazard area? You won't know that for sure, but I can give you a few tips on how you might figure that out if you're writing an engagement plan. So who's likely to be impacted? Who are the communities? And that's not just the people next door, are there surf clubs, are there like fishing and angling groups that like to go on that particular bit of beach or that little particular headland? What's the local socio-political context? And you don't have to pay too much attention to world news right now to know that that might really impact things when you're doing climate change conversations. And your local environment will be different, and we never know what to expect when we first start a project. We don't know how coastally literate they are. What other environment heritage constraints and other things like the capacity of the local community. So there's a few, I guess there's a couple of more complicated things to consider. If we're talking about a lower socio-economic group, we might actually have trouble getting people to come and talk to us. They've just got better things to do with their time, like make some money and look after their families. So you do have to really pay some attention to all of those things. And this is the define the proposal and the identify your stakeholder component of the planning process are so iterative because you're looking at both of those things at all times. Here is my way of trying to figure out the answer to the top couple of questions. This is not scientific calculation by any stretch of the imagination, but if I receive a scope request for a CHARMAP and I need to figure out how complicated the engagement is going to be, I need to have a decent idea about how many assets are going to be impacted. And the best way I know how to do that for erosion is to use the Broome rule and say if it's 0.4 metres sea level rise by 50 years and 0.9 by 100 years, which is what's in the policy, then it's going to be roughly 40 to 90 metres inland from the coastal vegetation strip. I know it's dirty for all the engineers that are listening, but for example, this piece of coastline, that's 97.05 here. I'm taking roughly from the edge of what I think is a really solid vegetation line. So I can already see that in this CHARMAP, I might have to be a little bit worried in 100 years about this stuff here. And in fact, 40 metres, I'm going to probably have some impact to a coastal cycleway as well. So I'm starting to think about that group of stakeholders as a primary group of stakeholders who are going to be interested, and I'm looking at the coastal path, I'm looking at this little structure here, I'm looking at these houses that are direct frontage to the ocean, and these houses that are sitting behind a road, and I'm seeing some challenges. If I play the game again, here we go, this is Floreat, look at that, nice wide reserve. It's a little bit sketchy, it's probably going to erode a little bit because the vegetation's not super solid, so they should probably do some replanting soon. But I'm probably going to be okay and not really hit that road too soon. Still more than likely within 100 years it's going to be in the hazard zone, but I don't need to be thinking about next year I'm going to have to move something. But I do know I've got some challenges here. And then if I jump to the next one and I look at something like Jindalee, I've got 100 metres, and of course Jindalee was developed in a more recent period, so it has an appropriate coastal setback. Look at that. But I can still see that this foreshore node has potentially some impacts. Foreshore nodes are obviously seen differently in the policy than housing and development, but that doesn't mean we don't care about them. It means we need to just recognise that. So that's the quick and dirty, like who might be impacted. That's kind of what I'm doing. I know in the real world, it's probably going to be more like 110 metres. Or maybe it'll be just 90 because there are no other factors that increase the number. If there's a regular cyclone that runs through the area that I'm looking at, I might start thinking that our S1 or our S2, which is the big storm bite, might make that number bigger. So I might add a little layer of complexity on it just because of those sorts of factors. And then of course inundation is much more complicated. So erosion is probably a little bit, it's easier to do on an aerial photograph with a measurement distance on Google Maps. Inundation is more, if you've ever been to the town and it looks pretty low and you're basically in the house right at the front, you are at the water's level, you might start wondering whether inundation is going to be a bit of a problem. The hotspots mapping and the new inundation layers, obviously really, really good tools. And of course then you get your best, worst day ever is when you can see it's really low lying and it's going to erode and it's half the town. So that, is a bit of a challenge. So that's my tips and tricks for before you've got mapping. What might the mapping look like? There is actually a lot of information. Sometimes we don't jump to those bits of information because we're a bit worried they might tell us something we don't want to know. But in engagement, we kind of need to know. Like, it is actually quite important for us to have a sense when we're writing the engagement strategy, what might we need to know to engage. This goes back to some of that socio-political stuff. If you really want to get a sense of what some of your communications challenges might be, hop onto Facebook and just type in the name of the place that you're talking about and wait to see what groups come up at the end of that search engine sentence. And you'll find a whole bunch of different council and community social pages, and you can have a little bit of a scan to see what people are reacting to. And it doesn't have to just be about the coastal stuff. Have they been arguing and advocating loudly for the cessation of some other activity near the coast that's going to get in the way? I think it's also important. Political preferences. I also suggest there is quite a bit of data now about the political leanings of a local area and their comfort with the term climate change, and obviously the demographics that I talked to before. This next slide is a bit of a matrix about how I might start to define the work that needs to happen. So if I take everything at this end of the page, things are a little bit more serious, and the green end, things are a lot less serious. At the top left, if I can assess that hazards are likely to be imminent and that large numbers of people are likely to be impacted, I'm going to start thinking of bringing it forward in the process, more of it. I'm going to start thinking about how much more power and control do I need to cede to the community so they can be in control of their futures. On the other end of the spectrum, if the hazards I think are very long term, or the data's really unclear and it's very difficult for me to get a gauge on because it just doesn't feel like it's going to be that big of a deal, I might think, okay, I can do some basic stuff, we can do some communication and engagement stuff, we can start to get the community across the language of coastal hazards, but we don't need to stress anybody out and we don't need to spend $100,000 on engagement. So there's also a dollar factor associated. So earlier, more serious engagement, more expensive. Later, less serious engagement, less expensive. There's a few other examples there. If you've already got the community agitating for something, say you've got a community that's agitating for the construction of a new groin, if you think maybe the groin might not be the best solution, you probably have to have a conversation with that community. If you've got community advocating for action, so maybe you've got a community that's just really wants to spend lots of money on doing revegetation in the coastal foreshore, and you look at that and you go, that's fantastic, but it might not be enough to do the job, then you also need to work with that same community because they have a different set of expectations from the engagement process. So all of this is, we're still in the defining phase. I guess while not dissimilar to other planning projects, I think what's more important with this one is that there are so many external forces. There is things like misinformation, so you'll have people in the community that tell you, if we just do this, everything will be fixed. There's mistrust as well that comes around this because it feels like it's all models and like black magic and stuff. And obviously the local and global political environment. So they can weigh heavily. I've said all this already. Pay attention to projects like historical coastal management. current agitations, things that are untested, nearby major projects that might become entangled. I feel like, if you're doing coastal hazard planning in the Coburn Sound right now and you've got Westport on the horizon, that's challenged. So those types of things. Existing sentiment. And then, of course, you've got things like major assets. So if you've got a wastewater treatment plant next to the coast in your study area, you've got some other issues to deal with. So all of those things are part of our definition of the context. As I said, there were some questions there on the earlier slide, and then there's some sub-questions. It looks a little bit like this. This piece that we've put together it also helps you identify your stakeholders. So it's not explicitly designed for that purpose, but it will help to unpack some of the stakeholders that you might need. So let's jump into that. So now we're talking about identifying our audience. So like I said, step 1 and step 2 work really, really closely hand in hand. You will naturally be uncovering stakeholders as you're looking at the context, and you'll be naturally uncovering context as you're looking at stakeholders. Audience can include, and this is kind of where I divide people up a little bit, people with a direct financial, spatial or social impact. So residents, people who live across the road, businesses who are located in the area, etc. We call them communities of place. But then there are also a large number of people we call a community of interest who will have some relationship to that coastline. So tourists, scientists, engineers, researchers, anyone with influence in the area, decision makers at various levels of government, etc. And that includes your local councillors as well, if they're not physically located within the hazard zone. And again, remembering you don't know exactly where the hazard zone is yet, so you're kind of making your best guess. Again, a series of questions. So we've got that previous slide that I showed, which has got questions about context. Stakeholders will start to emerge. And then you will map the stakeholders and their level of engagement. And we have a stakeholder database prepared for you, which is very specific to coastal hazard risk management adaptation planning. But yeah, really starting to look into who are the stakeholders and what is their current level of engagement and what possibly could they be involved in the process. Mapping key champions and engagement channels. So that little effort at running through your social medias is also going to find out some of your engagement channels. So you'll get a sense of who's around, who's who in the zoo, who's leading conversations, who's creating conversations, and how you might be able to share things. And that can include just local coast care groups. It can include surf clubs, any of those organisations. They will be great conduits. The other thing is you're looking at the longer term expectations of different stakeholders, and of course their other requirements, language requirements, cultural requirements, cost and time. And none of these are small things to consider. Languages, if you're dealing with a community that is by and large speaking in a different tongue, you are going to have to work quite a bit harder. You have to simplify things as much as humanly possible in your content, because it needs to be clear language. One of my tips would be to simplify the language as much as humanly possible anyway, without losing the rigour and the accuracy. I guess the other one here, I'm talking about cost and time, and that's really related to, that's not so much about the cost of doing the engagement. That's more about thinking about the cost to those users of engaging. So how much effort is required of them from a cost perspective? Like if we're inviting them to participate, does that mean they have to give up on doing something else that might contribute financially to their homes? Do they have to travel to come and see you? Is that a cost? Quite a lot of aspects of the stakeholder user experience to consider in this task. And of course, time. How much time does this community of people actually have? There are some communities where, small communities in particular, where they are asked to do so many things that your thing is just one more thing. And so we just have to be really conscious of that. So basic steps for identifying the audience. I start to think about what is their interest. So a stakeholder's interest in the project. Is it high, medium or low? The impact that the project is likely to have on the stakeholder. So again, we're still best estimating here. And then the influence. Their capacity to influence the outcomes of the project. This one can be a little bit more subjective, and it can be a real unknown. you might end up with a group of stakeholders that band together and form a group, and they become really influential that weren't apparent to you right at the start. But you would typically be able to see the sorts of groups that will have high influence over a process. And of course, then there's decision makers. It tends to give you a bit of a number as to how much work is expected to engage the stakeholder based on their unique relationship with the project. So we tend to differentiate stakeholders as primary, secondary and tertiary. There is a little bit of a trick to primary. We nearly always have ministers and parliamentarians and councillors as primary stakeholders. So one of the things in the tool that we've provided is, say, a member of parliament as a primary stakeholder versus the people that live across the road as a primary stakeholder. They're both primary stakeholders, they're both quite important. You might send this one a letter and say, this is our project, let us know if you'd like to talk to us. And these guys, you might do the same thing, but you might also then say, we want to speak to you. So primary doesn't always mean exactly the same thing. Traditional owners, there are a variety of different groups. So you may have traditional owners who are recognised through a determination of native title, like a corporation. You might have local Aboriginal people that have enduring connection to the land. So for example, Whadjuk people in the Noongar Nation will be all over the stretch of the Perth Metro Budja, which is Whadjuk country, but some of them may or may not be part of the Aboriginal corporations that exist, or they may or may not be permitted to be representative, but that doesn't stop them being stakeholders and doesn't stop them having connection. They also might have other connection to country. So if we're talking about stolen generation people, we're talking about people that have been dislocated from their own country, that then live on another country, they still have a connection. And so you need to have a think about that in terms of what's the way of reaching that group of people. And then obviously any other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people living in the study area. Community organisations like, for example, your Recfish West and your Fishability WA, they might have some interest, kite surfing groups, surfing organisations, all of those different groups. But I think one of the other things that I sort of start to think about is what is the local coastal environment, but what are the things that are relevant in the area? So if we've got lots of jetties and lots of rocks, you're probably going to find yourself some fishing groups. If you've got a surf coast, you'll definitely find yourself some surfing groups. If it's windy, you'll have windsurfers and kiteboarders. Swimming lesson classes, so you might be Department of Education and VACSWIM might be one of your stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. So you're looking at the physical coast, again, that relationship with the context setting. And of course, one of the things that you're really doing is trying to identify who they are, but also how they might help you distribute information. When we're talking about youth and culturally linguistically diverse communities, I've really leaned into the youth focus. If you've got a youth council in the local authority, that's amazing. If you've got a youth action plan or you've got established relationships, fantastic. Otherwise, you have to start working it, and working it's not that easy. The good news is time maps take a long time. So if you're trying to get into a HASS class, Humanities and Social Sciences class, you can't call the school principal and say, can I come next week and present to your HASS class? That's usually a 6-month process, but a child map usually is a bit longer than 6 months. So one of the first ports of call might be getting in touch with the local schools and saying, can we come and talk to your students? Called communities, the language is really important and trying to make it really simple. The best way of assessing this is doing a demographic analysis of your coastal localities and figure out if you've got high proportions of a different language spoken at home or other languages or other cultural heritage. ABS stats will give you that information. It's not going to be perfect, but it will give you a bit of a hint. Do you need to translate any of your content? And then all abilities group. Is there an accessibility reference group or similar? Is there a recognised community of users in the disability community, like a fishability group that meets every fortnight and goes fishing on that rock? Disability advocacy is quite often about easier access and comfortable, safe access. Young people, older people, somebody who's just had an accident's got a broken knee. They're all benefiting from that conversation, and their values are often quite widely beneficial to the rest of the community. Typical stakeholders, I think I've said most of these already. This is the more location-specific ones. Four-wheel driving, if you've got currently people four-wheel driving on the beach, that can get a bit contentious. Twitchers, the people that go bird watching. Caravan park residents, I've put that in inverted commas because there's not very many caravan parks on our coastline where you are technically supposed to be a resident, but they are quite regularly residential in some of those particularly more regional places. And so they have a different relationship with the coast than most other caravan parks, which most other caravan parks you might consider as businesses and you engage with them as a business community. But some caravan parks are definitely quite residential and they become quasi-residential communities. Anti-mining groups, and then other things like arts groups. So like if you're in Cottesloe, you probably want to engage with Sculptures by the Sea. You know, those types of things where you've got regular things happening on the coast. Festivals. Lots of festivals happen in foreshore areas, etc., etc. That's a bit of an example. I think I spoke to this before. We might say our local member of parliament is medium interest, medium impact, high influence. They're a primary stakeholder. So you're going to be a primary stakeholder if you're like highs and mediums. But your directly affected landowner is kind of high, and then medium to high. And that high quite often is related to how energetic they get. Now, this one is really important. It is really good idea to do your stakeholder analysis with other internal people. I mean, A, it's really good to do a lot of internal engagement in your organisation during child mapping, but B, if you are writing a list of stakeholders and how you engage with them and what the best channels are and how interested they might be, there's almost guaranteed to be another director in your organisation who has had some sort of engagement and understands that stakeholder as well. This is a classic example. This is Coburn, Coogee Beach, foreshore. Feels relatively local, but when we looked at the catchment and the number plate analysis of people going there, that's where they're coming from. Some of them are coming from Byford. So you also have to be really conscious that your coastal environment, they're all unique. They've all got different stakeholder catchments. And this is just a good example of one that's just got a massive catchment. This is just a screenshot of the stakeholder database. And you can start to see, I've got lots of cells hidden here, but you can start to see that we've given you lots of EGs. There's a few notes in the database to give you a sense of some of the tips and tricks for each of those stakeholders. And also the great news is once you've done one, you just keep adding to it and you just add more and more people and it's fantastic. So this is just a few notes about language that I use. Resident, anyone who lives in a study area, so owning or renting. Don't ignore renters. An owner, so anyone who owns a property in the study area, living in it or not. So yeah, certainly trying to capture owners who don't live in catchment. So you would have a look at your demographics. How big is your absentee landlord community? Again, user, anyone who visits and uses the coast in any way. An asset operator. This is quite important with an asset operator because you might have, just taking the wastewater treatment plant example, you might have a really significant asset and that asset owner might need to be much more heavily involved in your stakeholder communications, or they may need to be explicitly invited to be part of your steering committee. So bearing in mind that all child maps will end up with a steering committee of some type. The steering committee is usually quite generic. It's the local government, it's the Department of Planning, it's the Department of Transport. Maybe there's a local coast group that exists, and then my recommendation is add a few councillors to that list. But if you've got a particularly significant asset, you might want to add that stakeholder to your steering committee as well. And obviously businesses. I think I've talked this through as well. Yeah. So communities are complex. So really trying to get a sense of how they might respond to technical data will help guide who needs to be engaged. And of course, who to engage is still the best estimate until you start doing engagement. They will come out of the work if they want to be engaged and have not been particularly invited. And I said this before, but be flexible. So you really do want to leave room to open if you need to add extra things, and then also be wary of overrepresentation of one particular cohort. Obviously respecting the diversity of the community will lead to more stakeholders being aware, so obviously very important. Okay, so let's jump into design, which is the sort of the fun bit. Prepare the community and stakeholder engagement strategy. Obviously those two first steps help you really define what you need to do here, and of course considering the specific challenges, aka that chart that I showed earlier, will help you figure out whether you can go down a minimal approach or whether you have to do something a bit more serious. And I'll talk through some of the things that you might do at different stages. So this is about values. The guidelines describe values as social, environmental, infrastructure and economic. Let me jump back to this one. And these were the things that I left off the slide previously. So level of engagement, minimal all the way to extensive, but also yes, expensive. And then project timeline. So at what stage in the char map you'll really put your energy into it. So red to the left, green to the right. It's not good or bad, it's just you need to, it's a bit of a warning at the left-hand side if you've got these conditions. And you start to think about how extensive your engagement will be. One of the things that I do on some projects is maybe delay this values bit until I do have the mapping, if I think it's going to be a real issue. And that's a negotiation with the client and et cetera, but it might be that we need to have some more information before we do the first engagement, just so that we don't go into a room without information for them. So in this case, I'm going to be looking at something more serious, bringing it sooner into the project, maybe talking a little bit more directly, a little bit more honestly, providing a little bit more information about what might the challenges be when I'm doing that values work. Misinformation is always one of my favourites. I should say misinformation can be like weird internet news that's just odd. But it can just as equally be somebody being told that the groin will fix all the problems. And so the community gets in their head that a groin is the solution. And then the engineers come in and say, that's a terrible solution for that coastline. And you're like, okay, we've got to deal with a whole community that's been convinced that the groin is the right solution. And then this one is the second on my charts. And anyone who's been in community engagement's probably seen something like this before. Stakeholder influence reduces the further into any project you get. Because you've done all your work, you've started to put all your reports together, you've made your recommendations, and if they want to change things over here, it starts to get really expensive. We've all had the situation where we've already spent the $200,000 of the char map, and then you have to do some more modelling. That's the sort of stuff I'm talking about. So when you're looking at the previous slide, and then you're looking at this one, there's some of the decisions that you have to be able to put together. And that's the point of no return, and I've just put them all together. Like I said before, if you're at this top end of the spectrum and you've got all of this stuff happening where you know that there's some big challenges, either physically the hazard zone is significant or there is quite a lot going on in the community, you probably want to give the stakeholders a bit more influence earlier in the start of the project. When you get to this sort of stuff here, you might be okay to leave it to a little bit less serious till the back end of the project. So one of the other things that you will have access to is a matrix of different types of engagement tools that we use. It is not dissimilar to the matrix in the Guide to Best Practice Engagement, but it is specific examples that we've used in char maps. So hopefully that adds some value to it for you. You've got the engagement plan tool in the Best Practice Guide. All of those links will be there for you. You can modify it to suit your own needs. This is what the matrix will look like. To describe a method, it will give you some key information. So how much it will cost, how you might deliver it, whether in person or online, what level of the spectrum, of the IOP2 spectrum it might be, when you might employ that effort, the amount of resources required, and which sort of stakeholders it's suited to. So this will be, for example, typically you would do something like this during the public advertising phase of a draft char map. It's got some pros, it's got some cons, again, really specific to char maps or coastal hazard planning generally, and that's just another example. And so of course, there are some in the yellow box where it's actually suggesting that you get expert support If you have that capacity internally in the organisation, fantastic. If you don't, that's when you start to look at adding that to your scope of works. These are some typical activities in stage 1, so mapping. The one on the left is an online mapping tool where you drag and drop pins. The one on the right is an in-person mapping tool that we did in a workshop. Both of these were fairly serious projects. You can replicate the same activity both online and in person. In both of these scenarios, we also had a workshop where we essentially did the mapping tool together in person, and that's, if you think you've got a slightly more imminent project and you're wanting to do values assessment engagement in stage 1 and you really need to get people face to face, this is a great tool because people really know they know their coast, they know what they love about it. The benefits of doing it in person on this one, I have to rely on whatever Fred wrote when he dropped that pin, and if he did not present his material to me accurately or clearly, I have to make it up a little bit. So I can make some assessments that people are liking foreshore-based activities and that Fred likes a foreshore-based activity, but if it's not clear what he likes about it, I don't know. Whereas here, if I run the exercise properly, I can get the dots, I can get the pins, but I can also dig in a little harder and say, tell me a bit more about that, because we've got a two-way conversation happening. More typical stage 1 activities, drop-ins, barbecues and sausage sizzles. Again, something like that, really, really good if you are struggling to get a lot of people's attention, but you have a nice foreshore park that lots of people go to. Typical stage 1 activities is surveys. We nearly always use surveys. In fact, I can't think of a time we haven't used a survey to do the values assessment, but you do have to be really careful. If they're too long, people get bored. Again, the conversation is one way and you cannot interrogate what it was that they specifically wanted to say. So if I do an in-person engagement, I get a much clearer picture of what they're telling me than if I'm doing it online. But again, high impact, imminent risk, really big concerns in the short term, face-to-face, doing a lot more of that. Low impact, unlikely to be a significant problem for 50, 70 years, survey online might be just fine. There is some tools in the guidelines in Appendix 5. There's a fairly standard value survey, and then there are some more complicated components to that, discrete choice experiment tools that have been prepared by UWA. Try and keep them short, try and keep them simple. That's some materials. We've put some other materials in the package as well. This is what I was saying before. This is a workshop environment that we convened in Mandurah. And this was because we saw high impact, imminent issues, relatively high risk and high coastal use. And in stage 1, we convened a community engagement panel for the char map. The community engagement panel, through an EOI nomination process, 4 meetings. The first one was in stage 1, and we delayed it until we had the hazard maps and we presented the hazard maps. We did that at the very start of the project because the challenge was very obviously a decent one. And we thought if we get a group of people that can come on this journey with us, they can help us make decisions later. We did meeting 2 and 3, which was stage 5 engagement. I'll talk about that a bit later. And then stage 6 or stage 7-ish, we'll present the draft to them pre-release of public advertising. So this is where double asterisks, we're really concerned, and we really, really want to make sure that we're embedding a decent group of people to bring them on the journey and help us do the planning work. And I think what was really nice is we ran a few different things, and you can start to see that, like, consistently across the online tools, the survey tools, and the panel, we really saw really consistent feedback across all the groups, all the different ways of engaging. What that meant is that we were much more comfortable taking those values and converting them to assessment tools in our multi-criteria assessment. The values engagement is a direct input. All of the modelling of the hazard lines in the world is not going to tell you how people use the coast. And so this values part is really significant. The reason we did that panel for that particular project was because we knew that we had to start making recommendations for decisions that would have to get made sooner rather than later. If we don't have to make decisions for the next 50 years, the values are important, but it might be more of a longitudinal assessment. How do the values change over the review cycles? So if you think about it in those terms, you can start to identify how much effort you need to put in to get the values from the community. The values help make decisions, and I've said almost standard. The criteria that we use in multi-criteria assessment. See previous modules for all of that stuff. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but nearly all multi-criteria assessments or MCAs that I've seen have a similar set of criteria. Somewhere along the line we talk about technical criteria such as whether it does the job, whether it is really expensive, all of those things, and then more values-driven criteria, i.e. how does it impact our community, how does it impact on our use and enjoyment of the coastline, how does it impact on the environment. This one here, I think I've talked a bit about this before, and it's really just that misinformation piece. This is just, I guess, a warning about where you are at stage one. Don't sort of separate misinformation from unintended and malicious. It just is misinformation. Where it becomes different is, I guess, how intentionally or unintentionally it's being used, and then what you need to do about it. At stage one, if you can see a lot of misinformation in the community, you really need to work quite hard on your communications materials with lots of frequently asked questions, regular direct communications, regular updates. The more information that you have publicly available that is accurate and agreed to by your steering committee, etc., the better. Now, it looks like I'm jumping ahead, and I am. I started with stage one because the guidelines are really explicit about engaging in stage one. But I've jumped ahead to stage 6, 7, the public engagement, advertising of the chart map. And I've jumped ahead to here because stage 1 and this public advertising part are the two explicitly referred to parts of the guidelines. And I'll jump back to stage 5 in a sec. Typical, I said this before, drop-ins and public displays, council briefings, etc. And then where relevant, if you've got existing formed groups, like the example I presented before, you might do a briefing workshop with them to describe the actions, obviously other types of briefings. If you do have some briefings through this stage 6 phase, you might reduce overall fear if you are there and present and people can talk to you. It's not always the case. If there is a community of people that's really unhappy about the chart map's recommendations, hopefully you don't get to that stage. But if there is, you've got a much better opportunity to talk people through the elements that you're talking about if you are in person with them. So let me jump back to stage 5 and that elusive multi-criteria assessment. So the multi-criteria assessment used in lots of different scenarios, but essentially you are trying to compare options against each other. And it gives you a sense of which ones are going to be overall net beneficial. So that's why we do it. Back to the values, the reason we do the values assessment is a little bit about sort of a lens over the top of this bit, but really trying to make sure that we get those scoring numbers right. A lot of chart maps do this with a technical team, maybe the steering committee get involved and they do all of this, and they use the values taken from the values stage 1 to do this assessment. Every now and then you do something like I was saying before, where you start to look at something with the community, doing the assessment with the community. And that would be because you need to work with the community to help them to understand how complex the decisions are, how soon they might need to be made, and what the implications of those decisions are. So in this particular example, the panel that I mentioned before was reconvened. We spent 2 Saturdays going through adaptation options across 10 management units. You can see how much work they were doing. It's a big commitment that you would only do if you really had some serious concerns. It certainly helps the community understand how complex the decision making is. But you don't have to do that if the decision making is not complex right now. So you would only do something like this if you do have to make some decisions and the community does need to be across that. Obviously, it's better if you've got time. This is not something you do in a 1.5 hour workshop. So that's just an example of where you might lean into really serious engagement in stage 5. If I was to go, okay, what's a slightly less full-on version of that, but also that gives people the opportunity? I've done one where we've had a 3-hour session and we've just presented the MCA process, and we've asked them if they think we were right or wrong. So that's calibration 2. It's just not as healthy a conversation because there's not quite as much time to unpack what's going on. But that one, obviously, if your decisions are much further down the track, something like this would be an excessive amount of financial commitment. My last hint about doing something like this, only do it if you mean to use their inputs. All right, stage 7 plus, beyond the char map. This is the easy bit, sort of ish. It requires commitment, dedication, and not falling asleep at the wheel. That's all I'd say about this bit. The guidelines imply that you continue engaging beyond the char map, but they're not really specific about it. It does talk about regular review, which of course has its own implication for engagement. But if you're a long way in the future before you need to do your review, it might be a long time between drinks and you might not talk to the community about it for ages. The reason I would say to you, don't let them fall asleep, is because if you keep them talking about it, they will continue to learn about it. The last thing that we want to do is have to start again. Find a whole new group of people to share information with. If you can keep the dream alive between final char map and the next one, amazing. So stage 7, there are some things that you can do that don't look like engagement, but that are. So things like installing CoastSnap so that you keep people involved, and perhaps having a QR code on your CoastSnap sign so that they go to a website where all your documents are. Doing planting days, but always introducing in those planting days the reason why you're doing the planting, which I think is quite often poorly understood. If you've got a really active community engagement process from your char map, keep those people on board. Some local governments have got really good websites where they've got all of their material. They continue to hold a web page for their char map, and it's easy to find, and you search such and such locality char map and it takes you to a page with all of it amazing. And sometimes you press the same thing in a search engine and you have to find the information in about 7 different places on a website. That's awful for the user. We've basically designed it now. We know how complicated it is. We know what the context is. But let's not forget that we always also have a formal project steering committee, minimum standard. In my recommendation, particularly if we've got one of those imminent impact, high challenge projects, is to see if you can have elected members in your steering committee. And the reason for that is they are a peer group to the broader council who will have to make decisions about the char map at some stage. Whether they endorse the char map or not, at some stage they're going to have to make some decisions about coastal hazard adaptation, and they need to be informed. Obviously, if you do or don't have elected members on your steering committee, it is still really good to keep them briefed, the councillors. So regular briefings, and of course I said this before, but including any other major stakeholders in your steering committee. This is implied in all of the material about best practice engagement, is that you prepare materials to support it. So things like what's going to be on your website, what survey tools you're going to use, what sort of letters you might send, social media, frequently asked questions, etc., etc. Helping as many people as possible go to the same knowledge source. These are the other bits and pieces that we've got some example frequently asked questions for you. We've got some, obviously abbreviations are not that complicated, and then some common definitions and a plain language guide. So if I was going to say where we're sitting in terms of what's a very standard sort of minimum approach through the guidelines versus what might we do in certain circumstances. So in stage 1, your steering committee, your comms and engagement plan, you do your values engagement. If you have a particular need, you can jump into key stakeholder groups, more meetings, different surveys in person, so you can expand on that. In stage 2 to 4, obviously you continue with your steering committee meetings and internal stakeholder briefings and council briefings. But you might also continue to meet with different stakeholders if there are emerging issues when you're doing your modelling and you're finding out more information. You might continue to hold community events, or like the example I presented, you might hold off on your values engagement until you've got some of the mapping so you can introduce it. Stage 5, risk treatment, again, fairly standard, or you can go into doing more workshops and meetings regarding the multi-criteria. And then of course, 6 and beyond, through to your public advertising. If you want to go harder, you can convene an ongoing coastal reference group. There's a few of those forming now, or different focus groups. Maintain a project website, and you can also start to get the community involved in things like citizen science through monitoring programs, etc. So all the hard thinking gets done at the start, and then you go into delivery, and then you've got to manage whether it's going on track or off track. That's when you start having to be flexible. So up until now, you've got quite a lot of control. It's great. And then you get into delivery, and that's when things really start to get a little bit out of your own control. Do your engagement strategy, review and analyse, and then what effect have you got? Really simple. Be prepared to modify if things change or if it becomes more contested. Practical tip, if you haven't already thought about this before, use past methods that worked really well. If your budget is tight but you still think you need to do decent engagement, perhaps give yourself more time for the length of time. Instead of trying to commit yourself to an 18-month chart map, maybe say we'll do it in 2.5 years and we'll spend a little bit more time allowing the information to percolate organically. So if budgets are really tight, that might be a way of getting yourself a little bit more time to get the engagement done. Just keep it open for a bit longer, and that will help get distribution through. Or piggyback on other events. So do things with other things that are going on, being really careful not to create confusion. A few more examples, lots of information. The one on the top right is something that this is just that example I was talking about before about continuing to keep people informed. The one on the top right is a video series that the Shire of Gingin had running for about 3 years, and then the people that were doing it left, and then it stopped. And that, I think, such a shame, because I think it would have really would have helped. And all that information is now really hard to find. I had to do some really, really deep Facebook searches to get that, because I knew it existed. If I didn't know it existed, I would never have found it. Lots of information about timelines, etc. is really good. Be careful of tricky topics. Predictions versus perceptions. I've used the term revisionist history. It's one of my favourite things is when people say this coastline's never changed. Obviously, who pays is complicated. You've had a whole module about benefit distribution analysis, so I'm not going to jump into that, but it is challenging. We try and give people as much information as possible about where the money comes from. There's obviously a few other things there about climate change and myths and misconceptions, etc. Shock and outrage management is probably a session all to itself. But yeah, if you can continue to keep the same amount of information publicly available for as many people as possible, consistent messaging, that's going to help as much as possible. There will be situations that you can get out of control, and that just requires a different approach. And then you analyse, you document your engagement. You absolutely have to document your engagement. It should also include evaluation. So we've got some tips on the sorts of things that you might evaluate in engagement with the material that's supporting. That gets you to the end of your engagement process, and everything went well and nothing went wrong. Last few slides. Engagement follows a standard approach. Obviously, the level of engagement should fit the circumstances. The tools that we'll give you quite a bit in how to identify those things that might require a more intensive engagement. This is probably one of my key takeaways is communities are amazing. They never cease to amaze me at their ability to really understand things. And if you give it to them straight, help them understand what's available to them to choose from, they will be amazing. Any of those community members that attend something could just as easily be the local council member at the next election. So assume anyone in the community can be a decision maker at the next cycle. And they do have the capacity to be there. One of the other things is don't be afraid of being honest with the trade-offs. There are very few coastal hazard adaptation options that are neutral. They're all a challenge. And I think it's worth being honest about that. Of course, if the challenges are really imminent, the honesty levels need to just peak a little higher. Your community is probably going to be there much longer than you are to deal with the adaptation issues. So let them be in charge. There's no better time to talk to the community than now. Resources, lots of tools, templates, etc. That will all be available on the training page for you. Hopefully there's enough there so that you can take those tools and break them a little bit and make them your own.
And with that, thank you for listening into this training session, and good luck with your CHAR maps and good luck with your community.